Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette 163, where we get philosophy and read and review it live on air. Although I don't know if anything is actually ever put out in airwaves anymore, light waves anymore. Because America at the moment, we're doing papers in the area of philosophy of race. Why not? So let's take a look at what we got in philosophy of race. Here we go. Now I was wondering, because I was just doing stuff from the unclassified, so maybe I'll just go to a subcategory. I don't know. Let's just see. Order categories. Yeah, this is material to categorize. Yeah, we could do other stuff. Let's see. Is there? Because I mean, I looked at a bunch of this stuff on the first page. There's, of course, 4,000 things to categorize here. But let's see. Topics in philosophy of race, racial identity, racism, politics of race. Yeah, I don't know. This is roulette. You just have to go. Alright, so what I'll do is I'll click, because I went to page 2 the other day. Let's just go to page 3 today and see what's on page 3. Why not? Okay. I mean, I do like doing stuff that's more recent, which makes me concerned, but stuff to categorize, you see, is like a 1995 article. Yeah, I don't like this. It's all 1935. Wow. Okay, 1914. So these are stuff that must have been just recently uploaded. Yeah, I like to try to do something that's contemporary if possible. So let's see, maybe I can. See if there's some way. Let's see, is there some other way to search through this area? I mean, there's so many papers, of course. So, let's see. Oh, that's what we could do. Go look at the biggest area. By numbers. Topics. Oh, that just may also mean it's the least categorized. African American philosophy. There we go. Because that's what we're sort of the topic of the moment. Let's see. So, is there something here? 1993. Yeah, see, this uncategorized stuff is not, no, forthcoming. Oh, maybe I could just do... Is there forthcoming? No. Yeah, let's just take a look. An ontological plausible speech. 1993. Whatever. Wait a sec, I got a better idea. Let's go to Phil Archive and then do the same thing and see if we can, Does this have categories in it? No? Did that not work? Huh. There we go. Let's see what all categories have. May have found a bug in Phil Archive. Wait. What's going on here? It just searched down to here. Can I clicky on it? Come on, clicky. Okay. Because I assumed the, categories would carry over from full papers. So at least these will be here, and I can maybe just get a, let's see what we have here. Material to categories. Interesting. Alright, so. Studia Covert Social Constructions. Interesting. So that's 2019. Let's see what else we have. So there's a review of something by George Yancey. This is just read this one. Woman of Color and Philosophy book review. What do we make of the concept of race? Massimo. This will be a biology thing. So there's nothing wrong with the philosophy of biology, of course, but it's not. It's gonna be more of a philosophy of science paper than a philosophy of race paper. But Why should I be biased against that? Towards the liberalness of race and sex. 05. What's wrong with racial private? Yeah, see, these are some of the older ones that just got uploaded. Conceptions of race. This APA newsletter. Did I read this one? I did read this one. I read this one a while back. That was a good paper. If anyone's interested in it, Understanding Race, the Case for Political Constructionism and Political Discourse. It basically claimed the way you understand race is really how you understand your political groups, and the construction of the political group is basically how you're understanding race. Okay. Biomedical research. Patient. Cladistic subspecies. Alright, that's more philosophy of biology. Let's see. Ethics of belief against the new metaphysics of race. Interesting. Unnaturalized racial naturalism. Yeah, see, this is stuff that looks more like that was cross-listed. Like it's more philosophy. That stuff's more philosophy of science. So let's just see if some of this stuff is here. Oh yeah, of course all this stuff should be here. Why wouldn't it be here? It's on Phil Archive. Alright, so this is the, this was the old one from Phil Papers. Alright, how to achieve reference social construction studio. Alright. Studying history of biomedical sciences. Towards a lived understanding of race and sex. Philosophy Today. SPEP supplement. I don't know what that is. Well, this is an old paper too, 2005. Alright, our racial consciousness. Let's take a look at this one here. I mean, I don't know exactly what the APA newsletter is. That I think that's just a supplementary thing to like the newsletter. I just don't. Let's just see. I mean, if it's not like real, if it's just like sort of a 53. Oh, that's right. Okay, so there's the whole thing. Where is that? Yes, this isn't actually a philosophy journal. This is kind of it's a newsletter. You know what? That doesn't. Should I be angry about it being a newsletter? No. Might as well read the newsletter then. Okay, so what are we looking at here? This is, what do I have to find? We have to find... is it this one or was it the other one? I don't even remember now. Shoot. Yeah, okay. So you know what? Let's download this and we'll read it, and why not? Download. So the link is now in the chat. If anyone wants it, you can always get the link to pop back up by typing !paper. And then if you enter that into chat, the link will pop back up too. So. Okay, so, yeah. Alright, it's back. Latino issues in philosophy. Are our racial concepts necessarily essentialist due to our cognitive nature? Eric Bayruns, Garcia, the Graduate Center at CUNY. The Corona neighborhood of... yeah, Corona, was that in Queens? In New York City has been a predominantly Dominican neighborhood since the late 70s and early 80s. One day in the summer of 2000, I was on my way into Manhattan on the elevated number 7 metro line Who calls it the metro line? I don't know. Subway. And I witnessed 2 Dominican women arguing quite loudly outside of the turnstile to enter the metro. Metro. Well, yeah, it's not the metro, it's a subway. The women's heated argument devolved from personal insults to just one thing, which they said to each other over and over. Their argument devolved into them yelling at each other that the other was blacker. What? Okay. Both women by U.S. standards would be taken to be black. The argument occurred in Spanish, and both likely came to the U.S. recently, or at least as adults, as could be told by their Dominican accents specific to the cultural region of Dominican Republic called Cibao. The takeaway from this anecdote is that these 2 Dominican women hurled what they thought would be one of the most hurtful insults that they could sling at their interlocutor, namely that their interlocutor was very black. Verbatim, one woman yelled, "Tu eres más negra," and the other woman responded, "No, tú eres más negra." This is my complaint about calling the subway the metro aside. This is a very, very New York scene. This translates to the first woman saying, "No, you are blacker than me," and the other responding, "No, you are blacker than me." By my lights, the Dominican idea of blackness contains essentialist negative content, where the content includes such things as inferior moral disposition and inferior aesthetic qualities. Here, the Dominican notion of blackness at least partly explains why the argument was so heated, because in Dominican culture, attributing blackness to someone implies 1, that they are necessarily lacking in aesthetic value, and 2, that they are necessarily morally deficient or inferior. And if someone implies that another person is necessarily aesthetically lacking and morally deficient, then this plausibly will cut deep as an insult. I argue that this anecdote is incompatible with recent work from Ron Mallon and Daniel Kelly on the nature and content of subjects' racial concepts and representations. Specifically, it is incompatible with Mallon and Kelly's claim regarding racial representations content in mixed race cultures like those from Latin America. Yep. If anyone has any questions in the audience, please let me know. I will try to answer it, but this is my first time reading it too. In the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy of Social Science, Ron Mallon and Daniel Kelly argue that racial representations are non-trivially fixed by innate domain-specific species-type mechanisms. They claim that many social scientists and race theorists do not properly countenance these psychological mechanisms in their explanations of racial difference, because many social scientists and race theorists have an anti-psychological and anti-individualist bias. This bias prevents race theorists from properly understanding the role that human psychology plays in creating unjust racial outcomes, because these outcomes are a result of innate human dispositions to categorize people by race. Alright, so this is an interesting claim here. It's saying that there's some underappreciated part of our psychology that is going on, that explains sort of our disposition to categorize people by race. So that's interesting that there's alright, so we'll have to see what they mean by this underappreciated psychological feature. Mallon and Kelly distinguish between 2 kinds of social constructionism about race. The first is a kind of parallel constructionism. Parallel constructionism is the view that both racial differences and racial representations are the product of joint human choice and decision. The second is a kind of hybrid constructionism. Hybrid constructionism is the view that joint human decision does not completely explain racial representations' content, but rather a more complete explanation must refer to innate psychological mechanisms which constrain racial representation's content. Mallon and Kelly endorse hybrid constructionism, and they claim that most race theorists are parallel constructionists. Or paradigm examples of parallel constructionists are Linda Martin Alcoff, Sally Haslinger, Charles Mills, and Paul C. Taylor. Mallon and Kelly claim that hybrid constructionism predicts at least that 1, racial representations are stable over time, and that 2, racial representations should vary in more mixed race cultures than in cultures where there is less race mixing. I argue that hybrid constructionism predictions do not obtain, and thus hybrid constructionism requires further evidence. I argue that the historical record is inconsistent with hybrid constructionism, and I suggest that humans may not be innately disposed to categorize people by race, even though we are likely disposed to categorize people into in and out groups. So in this paper, I show that there is evidence to set that there is an evidence set that is inconsistent with hybrid constructionism. I'd like to make a small side note. I'm seeing this distinction quite a bit the more philosophy of race I've been reading in the last few days, of what counts as that there are in-groups and out-groups, and I suppose that this is just playing off the sort of common sense, like, schoolyard example of, like, the cool kids, and then, like, the not the cool kids, like the outcasts. But I would like to, I'm sure there is some research on this, but I'd like to see what the real understanding of in and out group is, because even though I guess I have a preconceived notion from way back when of what counts as, like, the in people and the out people, I'm sure philosophers have said more interesting things in my thoughts on that. Yeah, so. Yeah, I'm going to have to think about in and out group. Why are some people in and why are some people out? And what does it mean to be in and out, and what is that? Anywho, continuing. Good prescriptions are based on good descriptions. Ooh, that's a cutesy little sentence right there. Good prescriptions are based... philosophy is... I have, after reading a bunch of it, there's lots of philosophy that is just not well written in terms of, like, writing stuff. I mean, it's excellent philosophy, but it's just not... You don't have any pithy sentences. You got just repetition, all sorts of things. And so this is nice. I mean, it fits perfectly on the line. Well, not really. They had to draw out the spaces here. But good prescriptions are based on good descriptions. Okay. So good anti-racist prescriptions should be based on good or accurate descriptions of why people's racial representations are racist or have essentialist content. Malin and Kelly's view of the social construction of race hybrid constructionism is inconsistent with much of the philosophy of race literature. If people's racial representations are constrained by innate domain-specific mechanisms such that they have essentialist content, then anti-racist prescriptions should reflect this. If parallel constructionism is true, then it plausibly makes sense to hold people morally accountable for holding, say, that whites are superior to non-whites because racial representations are primarily the result of human choice and decision. On the other hand, if hybrid constructionism is true, it plausibly makes less sense to hold people morally accountable for holding the belief that whites are superior to non-whites because racial representations are primarily the result of an innate domain-specific species-typical psychological mechanism. Or at the very least, if hybrid constructionism is true, then the way that we hold people accountable for holding that whites are superior to non-whites will importantly differ from the way that we would hold them accountable if parallel constructionism is true. Oh yeah, I want to say that there is a book called Reputation by Italian philosopher Gloria Origgi. We have to get much better grasp on the concept of reputation because it's sort of these distinctions, I think, can also be cast in terms of, like, good reputation, bad reputation. And she makes a very good, some excellent points about that. So that's a good book. It came out a few years ago, just as, like, all the madness was starting, or the contemporary madness was starting. So it's just like it was at the cusp of, like, the internet, and well, the internet was already big, but, like, it was ahead of the curve, you could say, I think, on some of this stuff, but, like, almost painfully so. It's like it was just like the postscript was about, like, some of the current problems we have now. It's like just got it in before publication. Okay. The paper proceeds as follows. Nothing to add. The paper proceeds as follows. In section 1, I explain Malin and Kelly's view that some of our racial representation content is due to innate human psychological mechanisms rather than solely or largely human choice. In section 2, I explain a study which suggests that we may not innately categorize humans by race. In section 3, I present evidence from antiquity that is inconsistent with hybrid constructionism's prediction that racial representations are stable over time. In section 4, I present evidence that is inconsistent with hybrid constructionism's other predictions that race representation should vary more in mixed race cultures because our innate mechanisms adapted to track species-like populations rather than mixed race populations which are not species-like. Okay, just the old index paragraph now, that ubiquitous index paragraph. Alright, section 1. Malin and Kelly suggest that there is a race puzzle. If race is not biologically real, then it is unclear how race can serve as a prediction basis for the social sciences. The idea here is that the social sciences require something real with causal regularity on which to base their predictions. And that might be the idea. I don't know if that's the case. The answer given by race theorists and social scientists is that categorizing groups of people can involve causal regularity because human social practices are done in accordance with categorizations. In other words, P1, our decisions can affect our categories. P2, our categories can affect our social practices. And P3, our social practices have causal properties. So C, conclusion I guess, our race categories can enable us to make predictions about people so categorized. If we categorize someone as a professor, then both the person categorized as a professor acts in certain ways because she is so categorized, and the rest of society acts in certain ways in relation to this person qua professor because she is so categorized. That this person acts in certain ways is what Mal and Kelly call a social role, where a social role is a set of expectations which the person who inhabits this role either consciously or unconsciously attempts to meet. Ian Hacking similarly points out that particular kinds of people can be constructed where kinds of people act in accordance with the idea of a particular kind because they have been categorized either by others or by themselves as a particular kind of person. Therefore, we can make predictions about this professor because she has been so categorized. You can always go back to the old Shakespeare, the king is kind, and it wasn't saying the king is nice, it was saying the king is of a type, and so you know the type of person the king is kind. It was not a compliment that was being paid to the king in that soliloquy. Mallon and Kelly call this the standard answer to what they call the race puzzle. This answer partly explains why, say, white American economic outcomes on average differ from black economic outcomes. By Mallon and Kelly's lights, the standard answer involves that both racial difference in the world and racial representations are socially constructed. On the standard answer, enough humans choose to live with, not remedy and perpetuate racial injustice such that racial injustice obtains. And on the standard answer, the racial representations are also a result of human choice. Here, there is what Mallon and Kelly describe as social construction at two parallel levels. One level of construction obtains at the level of actual racial outcome difference in the world. A second level of construction obtains at the level of mental representations of, say, white and black people. They call this kind of social construction at two simultaneous levels parallel constructionism. Mallon and Kelly reject parallel constructionism because recent work in evolutionary and cognitive psychology has suggested that important features of racial representations are examined by appeal to mental mechanisms that are species-typical, domain-specific, and innate. Rather, they endorse what they call hybrid constructionism, where hybrid constructionism is the view that these psychological mechanisms constrain our racial representations such that they have some content rather than other content. The kind of content that these mechanisms cause our racial representations to have is content of a racially essentialist kind. So, sometimes you, as I've said before in this thing, when you're reading stuff you not like immediately familiar with, sometimes you're gonna start thinking things. I can tell you right now, they're like what I'm thinking, and I'm betting where they're gonna go is that the psychological mechanism and essentialism, they're gonna attack these two things because the idea that there is a essentialist psychological mechanism is gonna be hard to. I can already tell you this is the setup here, or that's what I would expect the setup to be right there. They're sort of tipping their hand at what their argument's gonna be because. Why should there be an essentialism in essentialist psychology that we were all like born to have? Maybe that's the problem, but it's just what it looks like at the moment in terms of argument construction. So, like two philosophical points that are related, but you wonder how. Okay. Mallon and Kelly suggest that racial essentializing is a feature of our psychology, which was naturally selected or improved humans' fitness in an evolutionary sense. A racial representation is essentialist if it represents a group of people as necessarily having certain features, characteristics, or properties. So on a hybrid constructionist view, our racial representations are constrained by an evolved disposition to represent other groups in essentialist ways. This view differs from parallel constructionism because Malin Kelly's lights. Hybrid constructionism provides a more complete explanation of racial representation's content because it appeals to human psychology, but parallel constructionism provides a less complete explanation of racial representation's content because it appeals to human choice, and decision cannot as completely explain our racial representation's content. Malin Kelly suggests that some social psychology evidence supports hybrid constructionism. They cite experiments by Susan Gelman and Henry Wellman, where children attribute cow behaviors to a baby cow even though the child participants are told it was raised by pigs. They take this to show that humans will associate properties typically associated with a kind even when environmental and developmental situations are changed. More importantly, they take this to show that humans are similarly associate black typical properties with black child, even though the child was raised, say, by white parents in a white community. Or at very least, they take this to show that even young children represent others in essentialist ways. Section 2. In this section, I briefly explain a study which suggests humans do not have innate domain-specific species-type mechanisms, such as humans naturally categorize people into groups and share some racially determined essence. I grant that we may have mechanisms that dispose us to represent people in an in-group, out-group fashion according to some shared feature of a set of people. The study does not suggest that we do not have any such mechanisms, but rather it suggests that we do not have a mechanism of this kind dedicated to racial categorization. Okay, so the argument here is that the psychology is not so specific in some sense. The essentialism, even if we have it, it's not going to be of the racial kind or necessarily racial kind. The study I explained below is a psychology study in which Schutz et al. Tests whether 3 and 4-year-old children use social categories like gender or race to make first-personal and third-personal inferences about other properties and social relations. The study's participants were white male and female children from middle-class urban and suburban centers in New England and the Midwest. The study consists of 7 experiments. In the first experiment, gender rather than race was a more potent guide to social preferences when 3-year-old children were asked to pick with whom they would rather be friends. Here, 74% of children indicate that they would rather be friends with children of the same sex when presented with pictures of a male child and a female child. 54% of children indicate that they would rather be friends with children of the same race when presented with pictures of a black child and a white child. In the second experiment, when participants were asked to select an activity that they prefer, like having a pool party or having a birthday party, they were asked to indicate whether children represented in the photos either 1, a black or white child, or 2, a male and female child also preferred the same activity. 70% of participants chose photos with children of the same gender, whereas 53% of participants selected photos of children with the same race. Here, for 3-year-old children, gender rather than race was the salient social category. You know, I just wonder about these experiments. Even at 3 and 4 years old, you're going to be massively enculturated by books, TV, internet, and other such things. So I don't know if you can ever actually separate out innate characteristics of this way, because for a kid to be able to participate in such a study, like having birthday parties, having a pool party, to understand even these sort of concepts, they're going to have a concept of like pool party and what that is. And if you do that, you're going to have like images, pictures, and all sorts of things, which are going to have come in from some external media, because there's pool party is not an a priori concept. I'll take that as a given. So even then, like, how would we be able to track innateness when pool party has to essentially come from the culture? I mean, you have to live in a place with a pool. I mean, that already seems massively loaded. Anyway, that's a small aside right there. Okay, continuing. Neither the third nor fourth experiment showed any statistical significant use of both gender and race when 3-year-old participants made third personal inferences about either social activity, preferences, or social relationship preferences. Experiments 5, 6, and 7 all tested 4-year-old children's ability to make third-person personal inferences about others' social activity, preferences, and friendship preferences. In the fifth experiment, 70% of 4-year-old participants inferred that children prefer friends of the same gender 68% of children in this experiment inferred that other children prefer to be friends with their own race. Here, the older set of participants, 4-year-old children, used both gender and race to infer others' friendship preferences. Experiment 6 and 7 tested to see if 4-year-old children used race or gender to infer that people of the same gender or race prefer the same social activities. Neither race nor gender was found as a robust inference basis. Now we consider what this study suggests for race as a category that humans innately use to categorize others. The study seems to suggest that race is not a category which 3-year-old children use to first personally infer with whom they would like to be friends with and with whom they share activity preferences, whereas gender does serve as a basis upon which 3-year-old children make similar first personal inferences. Race also did not serve as an inference basis for 4-year-old children when inferring about social activities. I think there's like studies from the feminist literature. I mean, again, this is not like this race, gender, equality stuff is not my area, so I may be very wrong, but they did look into the effects of like body image stuff on very young kids. So I mean, I wonder how young that those studies go back, like when they were seeing what sort of how young the children are that start to get affected by like female body image concepts. And so if you cross correlate those like age groups then to this stuff, what would that show, if anything? But that there is definitely some sort of, because there's no way that certain like contemporary body types would be a have anything to do with what kids view about body types or why that would be innate. So it's like, yeah. So if that would show that the like sort of like the cutoff before when do you actually start understanding like things that can't be innate. So maybe you'd have to look before that, but it'd be getting really young, so it'd be really hard to draw conclusions using the sort of like cutoff of like before kids can even understand body types. Anywho, alright, so one explanation of the data is that children are predisposed to consider gender information when evaluating people, but does not possess dedicated mechanisms for evaluating others in accord with their race. That is, here gender seems more likely the innate category. This seems at odds with Malin and Kelly's hypothesis that we have innate domain-specific species-typical mechanisms which cause our racial representations to be essentialist in nature. Schutz et al. Notes that even on an evolutionary psychology, picture gender representations seem more likely to have mechanisms devoted to it than race because gender distinctions have been available much longer than race distinctions. Malin and Kelly took Gelman and Wellman's 1991 study to show that children represent species in essentialist ways. They also took this as evidence in favor of their hypothesis that children categorize people by race in an essentialist way. Schutz et al. Notes that children's performance in experiments 6 and 7 contrasts with previous findings that 4-year-old children use gender and race to guide category-based inferences about others' biological and psychological properties. What seems to explain this inconsistency is that Gelman used noun label like girl and boy to pick out targets which participants were supposed to match. Schutz et al.'s study did not use noun labels, but rather experimenters used pictures and pointing gestures to pick out matched targets. Schutz et al. Point out that Waxman tested whether the use of noun labels in picking out matched targets would make a difference, and Waxman's study, children did not engage in race-based property induction at all when the target was not described with a noun label. Okay, so I guess what they're saying here is that the previous results that showed a bunch of essentialism actually may have been due to the framing problem of how questions were framed and worded in noun ways. So that's interesting that in just changing the type of questioning, they got completely different results. Well, this shows the difficulty in getting good results. Waxman's study suggests the use of noun labels is what caused children to infer that cows would still exhibit cow behavior even though they were raised by pigs. If the use of noun labels is what caused children to categorize cows in an essentialist way, then Malin and Kelly's inferential leap to the conclusion that we humans innately infer in similar essential ways seems unwarranted. Yeah, so I guess if you're using essentialist talk to begin with, the kids sort of glom onto the essentialist talk and then infer in essentialist ways, which in some sense that as a criticism that makes sense, but of course it's interesting that it showed up so clearly in the psychological results. So it's a good study to show that that is a serious issue when doing psychological experiments. Alright, section 3. In this section I present historical evidence that is inconsistent with Malin and Kelly's. Alright, so, I'm liking the structure of this article. It shows the contemporary psychology, and then we're going to get a little bit of history, it looks like, here. And, did they actually do the metaphysics also? Yeah, see, what I was arguing about up here is that this metaphysical picture that, like, psychological and evolutionary mechanisms, they're doing the science, so a little bit of the evolutionary psychology. They're doing history, and I wonder if they're going to hit the metaphysics as well. So it's just a sort of a three-pronged attack against this argument. So that's nice in sense of why is this, how are they getting their conclusion here? They're doing it by showing a variety of different approaches to how one might argue for it, and showing that none of these things are even going to hold. So even if, like, the psychology, all right, you say, well, maybe the current psychology is a little iffy, but if you go back in history, it doesn't work. And then also then you can show even the premise. So we're working maybe up to the metaphysics. So the contemporary science didn't work up here in section 2. Then we're going to say even historically this doesn't seem to make sense over long periods, even though you can't do a scientific study. You can look at the history, and that might be wrong. And then you can finally you say, well, the concepts in section 4 doesn't even hold, and that'll be the grand conclusion, it looks like. So I think there's a well-constructed argument as far as philosophy papers go. Or it's there's plenty of well-constructed arguments. The construction of this argument is nice in that it is a well-rounded argument, I could say. A lot of, like, the logic arguments are excellently constructed, but they're very narrow focused. This is more of a well-rounded sort of approach. Okay, section 3. In this section I present historical evidence that is inconsistent with Malin and Kelly's claim that racial representations are stable over time. Malin and Kelly claim that racial representations should, on their view, be roughly the same throughout the historical record because we as humans are naturally disposed to categorize people in essentialist ways. Put another way, this mechanism determines that our racial representations have essentialist content. Race theorists largely agree that race as an idea or category was born sometime after Christopher Columbus reached the shores of the island of Hispaniola in 1492. Bartolomé de las Casas in the 15th century came up with the initial ordinal ranking of peoples because Europeans had to establish what kind of people first the Native Americans were, and then what kind black Africans were. It was quickly established that natives and blacks were human enough for salvation, but not human enough to enter reciprocal relations with Europeans. But this historical account of the idea of race's genesis is inconsistent with Malin and Kelly's claim that racial representations should not vary. On their account, essentialist race notions must have been present long before Columbus reached the shores of the Taino island of Quisqueya. Yeah, Quisqueya. Okay, the native word still used today to refer to Hispaniola. Greek and Roman antiquity seems like a good place to look for essentialist racial representations, which are consistent with hybrid constructionism, because the Greek and Roman world was well aware of very familiar with sub-Saharan and East African peoples who would qualify as phenotypically black today. It is well documented that there were sub-Saharan blacks living throughout the Greek and Roman world. Yeah. Race theorists and Greek and Roman scholars seem to largely agree that the modern notion of race, where race picks out some kind of biologically determined essence, did not exist in antiquity. Frank Snowden claims that even though the ancients 1. accepted slavery, 2. accepted intercultural ethnocentrism, 3. valued notions of beauty derived from their own cultures and others, and 4. distinguished people from other places as barbarians, the ancients did not have anything comparable to the virulent color prejudice of modern times. According to Snowden, most scholars who have looked at the evidence share the view that the ancients did not fall into the error of biological racism. Black skin color was not a sign of inferiority. Yeah, it was more city-state. Like, they liked the people that they grew up with, but it wasn't that, you could be from there, but, like, have a different skin color, I assume. Yeah. Alright, but this is what the historians say. Now, Snowden does note that the Greeks, Romans, and even Egyptians largely viewed their aesthetic canons as superior to others. But he also notes in earlier work that there are numerous examples of Greek and Roman literature of Greeks and Romans expressing admiration for Ethiopian aesthetic canons. The ancient Greeks and Romans referred to dark-skinned Africans as Ethiopians. Preferring one's own aesthetic canon can be explained by cultural influences rather than by appeal to innate mechanisms. Moreover, on the whole, the number of expressed preferences for blackness and whiteness in the classical literature is approximately equal. Thus, this aesthetic preference point does not seem consistent with hybrid constructionism, or at the very least, this aesthetic preference point does not seem to be evidence for hybrid constructionism. Now, Benjamin Isaac suggests that Greek and Roman were proto-racists. He argues that the root of modern racism can be found in Greek and Roman antiquity. However, I'm sure everything we do in the West is somewhat based in the Greeks. Alright. However, he admits that Greek and Roman antiquity did not know the sort of racism that Western civilization developed in the 19th and 20th centuries, since they had no concept of biological determinism. On his view, Greek and Roman proto-racism was based in group difference, which was caused by different environments. That is, Greek and Romans were at worst environmental determinists, because they attributed the difference that existed between groups not to biology or skin color, but rather to the way that environment affects our physical and mental constitution. Yeah, so it's like they were foreigners. They didn't like foreigners, I guess, because they're from some other place. So they were xenocentric, not racist. I mean, we've got plenty of xenophobia here nowadays too, so that's reasonable that they would in the past. Isaac likens their proto-racism to ethnic prejudice. Isaac says, if we read that people are stupid and courageous because they live in a cold climate, then it can be argued that it is a form of proto-racism, since there is the implicit assumption that these people are stupid through physical factors beyond their control. Here, even if we grant that the ancient Greeks and Romans were proto-racists in their racial representations, content was not determined or constrained by an innate psychological mechanism, but rather their racial representations seemed free to track non-biological reasons for differences between genetic populations. Thus, hybrid constructionism is inconsistent with at least this historical evidence of racial representations in Greek and Roman antiquity. Okay, so, I mean, they were stupid because they were from the north. That definitely doesn't seem racial, it just seems anti-location based, which is a different sort of thing. Alright, Section 4. I now present sociological evidence that is inconsistent with hybrid constructionism's second prediction that racial representations should vary more in mixed race cultures. Okay, so this is back to the contemporary stuff that shows that instead, it's not that the science underlying it is wrong, is that it gets wrong predictions too. Okay, so racial representations should vary more in mixed race cultures because our innate mechanisms adapt to track species-like populations rather than mixed race populations which are not species-like. Mallon and Kelly take Latin America to be a case where racial representations vary because of population mixing. Latin America differs from the U.S. because historically the U.S. population has been and is less racially mixed. Put another way, Latin America and populations are not sufficiently species-like for our innate mechanisms to track. As a result, Latin American racial representations do not have essentialist features which U.S. racial representations have. The first bit of evidence which is inconsistent with hybrid constructionism's second prediction is my own experience as a mixed-race person or light-skinned Dominican. I have seen and experienced firsthand that Dominican racial representations have essentialist content. For example, when I was a child, I was praised precisely because I was light-skinned, and light-skinned tone was thought to be inherently better than dark-skinned tone. I also witnessed familial mistreatment of family members because of their skin color. The motivation behind my family members' maltreatment and my good treatment are racial representations which contain essentialist content. The content is roughly that blackness is inherently bad and whiteness is inherently good. The inherent value comes from necessary properties people who are either black or white have. In the Dominican Republic, blackness is associated with Haitians, and Haitians are unfortunately thought to be thieves, uneducated, and generally immoral. Whiteness is associated with Spain, where Spain is associated with refinement, good pedigree, and the church. Linda Martin Alcoff similarly points out that in the Dominican Republic, black is defined as Haitian, and dark-skinned Dominicans do not self-identify as black, but as dark Indians or mestizos. This seems inconsistent with Mallon and Kelly's claim that racial representations will differ in societies which consist in mixed-race populations. Latin populations are mixed race, and the Dominican population is a paradigm example of a mixed-race population, but racial essentialism is prominent in the Dominican population's racial representations. Yeah, I mean, I don't have personal experience, but I mean, I actually have met plenty of Dominican people here in New York, and I think they've said similar things. So I mean, these are two anecdotes. This is the author's anecdote and my own secondhand stories I've heard, but like I think this is an accurate representation of the Dominicans I've spoken to about. I mean, I've never actually brought this up, but things they've said. So, continuing, evidence from sociology shows that in Latin American countries like Venezuela, Brazil, and the Dominican Republic, there is a correlation between one's socioeconomic status and the likelihood that one will either identify as white or identify closer on the racial spectrum to white, irrespective of one's actual skin tone. Edward Teles and Tiana Pascal suggest that high socioeconomic status tends to be associated with whiteness, or at least with non-blackness. This suggests that in Latin America, one, either white identity or identity on the color spectrum closer to white is preferred to black identity, and two, there is some kind of desire to be whiter in people who recognize themselves as insufficiently white. This is further evidence of essentialist racial representations at work in Latin America, where Mallon and Kelly claim there should be none. However, one could object that the sociological evidence does not show that Latin American racial representations contain essentialist content because Latin Americans value white identity above others, not because they think white identity is inherently or intrinsically superior to black identity, but rather because they think it is economically advantageous. That is, the average Latin American person values white identity not because being identified as white indicates that they have more intrinsic worth than others, but because being identified as white provides more economic and social opportunities. The objection fails because even if Latin Americans are partly motivated by economic considerations to identify as white, Latin Americans are also likely motivated by non-economic considerations to identify as white. In her study on Latin American consensus from 1850 to 1950, Mara Loveman concludes that tacit beliefs about whiteness contained in U.S. and Latin American consensus are very much alike. That is, Loveman concludes that racial representations in Latin America are similar to racial representations in the U.S., and racial representations in the U.S. by Mallon and Kelly's Lights contain essentialist content due to our innate dispositions to categorize race. Thus, there is a tension between Loveman's claim that Latin American and U.S. beliefs about white identity are similar, and Mallon and Kelly's claim that Latin American and racial representations should differ from U.S. racial representations in terms of their respective essentialist content. Loveman points out that among Latin American consensus that collected race data, the white category always preceded other categories like mestizo, mulatto, or indigenous. A mulatto is someone of both black and white ancestry. A mestizo is someone of both indigenous and white ancestry. Loveman says that this presentational choice seemed obvious, speaks to the successful naturalization of the idea that the category white belongs at the top of any racial hierarchy. That is, that the people who created the consensus uniformly assumed that the white category should be listed before the other identity categories, even in countries with non-white majorities, suggests that they took for granted that whites were the superior race. This defeats the objection that only economic considerations motivate Latin Americans to value white identity over others, because consensus creators do not obviously have an economic motivation to list white category before other categories on consensus questionnaires. Maybe. I'm not entirely in love with that. I mean, the capitalism kind of seeps into your brain, and so you start seeing things, everything in sort of an economic way. I've read a bunch of papers on neoliberalism and how it sort of dominates everything nowadays. So, assuming the sort of capitalists seeped into their brain, it may just be that there was some underlying sort of, excuse me, stuff, underlying sort of economic argument also to be had here, but that's not necessarily the case. This does also provide evidence that it isn't not necessarily an economic argument. Like, there need to be a further argument to show it wasn't the economic one that was here, or someone would have to present an argument that it really was the economics that underlie this. But so, it's not to say it isn't, but this is just another point in the author's favor here. The only Latin American consensus from 1850 to 1950 that did not list the white category first was the 1921 census. This was the first Mexican census after the Mexican Revolution of 1910. According to Loveman, census creators listed the mestizo category first as a deliberate political act. She says the inversion of the natural order of racial categories was clearly a political act by those who produced the official statistics. The inversion of racial categories suggests that the dominant racial category was white. Moreover, if the white category was not imbued with negative features, then the inversion would likely have not taken place because it would not have risen to the level of something that should be done. Yeah, why would you bother changing a form? That's just bureaucracy. A plausible explanation of the inversion is that whiteness was viewed by sentence creators as invoking things like the superiority of whiteness over mestizo identity, such that they felt compelled to invert the order of the white and mestizo categories. If this explanation is plausible, then Mallon and Kelly's prediction that racial representation should vary in mixed-race cultures like Latin America should seem less plausible. Alright, so, this section I think is a little, different from the other ones. These are sort of instances of counterexamples to the argument of how things should be predicted. The problem is, if you're going to make predictions, you can always sort of going back to the Lakatos, you can always find some other reason for why certain things happened at different times. I mean, I would think that Mallon and Kelly could also say, well, look, the political thing at the time was political upheaval. You can't exactly understand what was going on here because of the revolution. People had lots of ideas going on in their head, and so you can't necessarily attribute it to the psychology because so much other stuff was happening. And so it's like you can say we're wrong in that case, but you can't say exactly why we were wrong. Maybe we were right, but in this one case something special was going on because of the revolution. So this is a little different in sort of picking out counterexamples to predictions. Not all predictions are going to hold all the time, of course. So it's like personally, I like the metaphysics. I would have liked the argument instead. Look, and the concepts don't even seem to line up here. But maybe that we'll get some of that in the conclusion. But this is just it shows that there's a bunch of questions over the course of the history of this concept. How would it actually be used to explain anything? If it's not going to explain any of these instances where you think it would, then it has a problem in the concept of what sort of explanatory good is it, other than just disagreeing with just sort of trying to on the level of explanation that they say that they're doing. They're explaining more of certain outcomes. Then this goes to show that they were cherry picking what they were explaining, or they have a limited concept of explanation. And so I think that's the focus here, but not exactly. Maybe it should. Yeah. Okay. So conclusion. So I'll probably spell that out now. Conclusion. I hope to have made plausible the view that two of the hybrid constructionism's predictions do not obtain. The first prediction is that racial representation should be stable across history, particularly in populations with a relatively high degree of genetic reproductive closure. That is, across history, racial representations should exhibit essentialist content in societies where populations are relatively genetically homogeneous, because humans adapted innate psychological mechanisms which cause us to represent species-like populations as having necessary features. I have presented expert opinions that held that there is no evidence of essentialist racial representations in Greek and Roman antiquity. I take Greek and Roman society to consist in populations that had sufficient reproductive closure. Thus, there seems to be an inconsistency because, according to hybrid constructionism, there should be essentialist racial representations in Greek and Roman antiquity, but there is no evidence of them despite evidence of a large array of racial representations which are not essentialist. I also hope to have plausibly suggested that hybrid constructionist second prediction does not obtain. I presented my own first-hand testimony of racial representation with essentialist content in the Dominican Republic, and I live in New York City, in a New York City Dominican enclave. I also have presented sociological findings and observations which seem to inconsistent with this second prediction. First, I reviewed a study by Schutz et al., which cast doubt on the psychology study which Mallon and Kelly partly based their inference that we adapted an innate mechanism which causes our racial representations to have essentialist content. Schutz et al.'s study suggests that race is not used as an inference basis for three-year-old children in first and third personal inferences, and it suggests that 4-year-old children does not use race to infer third parties' properties. This research seems to cast some doubt on Malin and Kelly's hypothesis that we have innate mechanisms which cause our racial representations to have essentialist content. Okay, nice paper. Epistemic humility now. I don't actually love I mean, I like some epistemic humility, but I have some problems with it too. Like, that's a different problem. Like, this is a bugaboo of mine. Alright. What else to say about this? Yeah, the last bit, what I was just complaining about, which, again, is really not that bad. I mean, not bad at all. It's just sort of my own bias is what I like to hear about. Is, what was the claim? That they, better explanation, that the hybrid constructionism, where was that? Yeah, this explanation thing up here. Hybrid constructionism is a way to not completely explain racial representation, but that more here. Hybrid constructionism is the view that joint human decisions does not completely explain racial representation's content, but rather that more complete explanation must refer to innate psychological mechanisms which constrain racial representation's content. Alright, so this is this explanation thing I was saying at the end. So what counts as the representation's content, I think, is what, like, which predictions matter. So if you're going to say arguing according to certain predictions, how would you understand that? Then you have to know which predictions matter and which are just sort of irrelevant to your story. And I think that is kind of what's going on in this last section. So I would have liked to have been a little clearer on the notion of explanation here. And maybe that, again, this is my bias, not really a problem. But the notion that there's plenty of things that they can't explain shows that maybe the argument is that the explanation given by the hybrid constructionism is a limited sort of explanation too. And so in that sense, it doesn't have anything over the parallel constructionism. And perhaps is even worse, because it's getting things wrong. So, I mean, that's just part of the argumentative strategy here. I think that it's not a prediction-based, it's an explanation-based argument, really. Okay, I want to know more about in and out groups, but that's not really relevant here. That's just what I want to know. Good prescriptions are based on good descriptions. Yes, well-written article. So, okay, other than that, I thought, it was a well-rounded article in some sense. I like the appeal to being able to use the history as a current, for contemporary debate. That's always fun, that you can pull things in from long ago to show, look, if it was the case what they're saying now, then the concepts which we have good data on actually from a long time ago would be different. But if it was actually something stable over long periods of time, but that's not the case. So even the experimentation, the history is wrong, and then the notion of explanation in terms of prediction is also shaky. Okay, if anyone has any questions, please ask now or else hold your peace. And I guess I'll be back tonight. Otherwise, have a good day and stay safe out there, please. Epistemic humility now, epistemic humility now, epistemic humility now. Don't be so overly dramatic about it, Chuck. What software am I using to read these papers? This is called Ocular. It's made by the KDE Foundation. I'm running Ubuntu right now. And this is Ocular, and it's a fantastic, I've found, program. Because it has all these nice editing features you can build right in. So this is, it's called Ocular. Let me just... spelled that way. Whoops, I lost my... Let me grab you the link. Bewitched. There we go. Yeah, so, and I have modified, or I've just updated the settings to have slightly different things here on the left, these editing devices, so that I have more things that I like. So, like, you can do different kinds of highlighting, color things, and so like you can draw different colors. You can do different sort of underlines, and inline notes. You can put like words. You can do stamps. This is like fun, not approved, experimental. You can't really read it, but yeah. Okay, so thanks for stopping by anyway. Alright, so if that's it, I'll be back later. Have a good day and stay safe out there. Bye-bye.